Thank you for joining us today for Armchair Historians. I'm your host, Anne Marie Cannon. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. You can also find us at armchairhistorians.com. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you would like to support the show, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a subscribing member through Patreon. You can find links to both in the episode notes. In part 2 of our series, The Great American Experiment of Homesteading the American West, I talked to pediatric dentist and rancher Les Maes. Les shares his personal account of growing up on the family ranch, the history of which is rooted in the early days of the Homestead Act. The ancestral roots of the Maes family are fixed in New Mexico history. Les's direct ancestor, Juan Anastacio Maes, born in 1863, staked a claim in the second half of the 19th century in what is now Bueyeros, New Mexico. The 3,000-acre Maes Ranch continues to be passed down from generation to generation. The family ranch continues to be owned and run by the descendants of Juan Anastacio. Les Maes, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to just start right off with the question that I ask all my guests, which is, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
My favorite history goes back to our family and the homesteading of our family ranch. They basically put a claim on the land, and as long as you took care of the land, then you would have rights to the land. And so it is interesting because there was a lot of family members at the time, and they were at that point given 40 acres. And so over time, the family would take over certain sections of that ranch. So like right now, it's around 3,000 acres.
Wow.
Yeah, but back then it was each family had a little portion, right? 40 acres where they could do their ranching or farming, that kind of stuff.
So they bordered each other. So different
Yes.
family members acquired their stake.
Family or neighbors, but they had like different sections. If you had the opportunity to see it, now it's fenced off, and we have 3 separate sections, but the history is that it was 40 acres, and so there would be like little homesteads, little cottages, shacks, really. Most of them were just small cottages that have ruined at this point, but it turns out my grandfather, his house, it's still standing. It's like an adobe house with flagstone and adobe. It was my grandfather's grandfather, so my great-great-grandfather, who homesteaded the land in mid-1800s. My dad says that it was around 1863.
And where is this land at?
It's northeastern New Mexico. Bueyeros, New Mexico, which is by Clayton, Harding County.
And so where did your family come from?
Well, the history is kind of mixed, but, we have lots of family in that area, and there's kind of debate where they actually came from. So I've had family members trying to research that back to Spain, but again, there's debate on where the family actually originated from. As far back as I can tell is we had a lot of family in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and then they were migrating, and then they homesteaded that area. As far as I know is the homesteading, which is mid 1800s, but where it came from, there's debate on that.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah, if we research our name and they take it back to Europe, there's just some controversy. I mean, I've had relatives and uncles, and they've they went to Spain to try and research our name, and but I don't have any concrete evidence of that or paperwork on that.
That is fascinating. I mean, just that history alone, going back to the beginning and that the family claimed that area. Tell me more about your family and that area and the town that they're in.
It's a tiny. Now it's just a. I mean, it's hard to even call it a town. They do have like a post office, so I guess that's where it's called a town. But nobody mans the post office. They just have like the mailboxes there, and people come from around the area to get their mail. And it's actually in the parking lot of the church, which the church is a historic church. Well, they still had services up until recently with the whole COVID thing, but it's adorable church where we would go for Christmas mass, and yeah, it's just a handful of people. People come from around the county. They drive, which is actually pretty historic because, having stories from my grandmother, they would gather at school dances. There's a one-room schoolhouse that still stands, and so we can explore that area. But my grandma used to tell me stories that, that's how she met my grandfather, because everybody would go and meet in the one-room schoolhouse for the dance, right? And so that was like the big deal. The buildings are so far apart. So like the schoolhouse is actually on a separate section. You would think that it's in the same town. It's not. So the schoolhouse is like miles away, and then the church is in the middle of what we would call Bueyeros, the town, which has maybe like 5 houses in it.
How do you spell it? Bueyeros?
Bueyros.
New Mexico, right?
Yeah. It's by Mosquero and Clayton. The nearest major town would be probably Clayton. It's southwest of Clayton, New Mexico. And more people will know Clayton because they travel from Colorado to Texas. They drive through that. There's a highway that will take you from Colorado. You go down I-25, and then you go through. You turn eastbound to go to Texas, and you will drive through Clayton.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your family history, your personal family history, you can trace back to your great-great-grandfather.
On my dad's side, yeah. On your grandfather's side, we have a little bit more tracing. So like they can trace it back to the great-great-grandfather. On my grandmother's side, it's a little bit harder. We haven't. I don't have a lot of information on her side.
So what was your great-great-grandfather's name?
I have it on the family tree. I'd have to look at it. I mean,
Okay.
But my grandfather's name was Celestino Maes.
Oh, that's a beautiful name.
Celestino. I believe he was one of 12. And same with my grandmother. They had large families back then. It was in an effort to help with the ranching, which is hard work. The story that I am more familiar with is my grandfather, who ended up acquiring a lot of the land around there through what we were talking about, the 40 acres. And so like a lot of his brothers ended up leaving, or they couldn't pay the taxes a lot of times. And so they would pay the taxes and acquire the land. And right now, and I have a few pictures of my grandfather's house, so where he grew up, Celestino. And where our ranch is actually on the other side of the fence, which it's a long, complicated story, but my grandfather grew up on the house that we were talking about. Is like an old adobe house. It's with the flagstones. What happened, he met my grandmother, and then he built my grandmother a house on the other side of the fence. And so it's walking distance, 50 yards, I guess, but it's on the other side of the fence. And so now Celestino's brother ended up with that part of the land where the house was. And then there was a family feud. And in the paperwork, he made note not to sell to the Maes. So it
So
was
this
a
is where the adobe house was on the other side of the
and
fence.
so there
Okay.
are two adobe house now. So the original one where my grandfather grew up is still there and we can see it, but it's on the other side of the fence. He made a house for my grandmother, which is where they raised my parents or my dad and his brothers and sister. And so where my grandmother's house, the house that he built for my grandmother, is where we have the ranch now.
Who owns that other part of the land?
Well, now it's the neighbors. It's the neighbors. It was my dad's Theo Eloy had the land, but there was a family feud between the brothers, and he refused to sell it back to the family. So he sold it to a random person because
Okay.
he just upset
Interesting.
the family. That part, which is so historic for us, because we basically are on the other side of the fence, and when we sit there, we can see my grandfather's house, and nobody uses it. I mean, there's nobody there. The longer it sits there, the more chance it's just gonna.
It's deteriorating.
Yeah, it is. The roof is already. It was a wood roof, but the walls are still up with.
When was it built? Do you know?
I would guess. I'm gonna guess early 1900s. It might be late 1800s actually.
So it's pretty old.
Way back, and you can still walk through there, and it is kind of interesting, and you can see the different rooms. And that was my grandfather's house. My grandmother's house was actually on top of the mesa. It's still there, and we own that part, but it's on top of the mesa, which is on a separate part of the ranch. And that one, my grandmother grew up, it's a 2-room flagstone adobe house with no water. They basically had one room where they would live in, and one room was like the kitchen, and one room was like where the kids slept in. And in fact, I have a picture of that one, but it's hard for me to share. But
Okay, well, I'm anxious to see it. Just send it to me through Messenger or whatever, and I'll
yeah,
figure it
I'll
out.
send you a handful of pictures that I have. One of my dad's side of the family tree, and then a few pictures of the ranch, and it's just
Yeah.
it's what they call enchanting, like the New Mexico side of or that landscaping, New Mexico. It is different. It's different than Colorado, but beautiful nonetheless on different viewpoints. We consider it very beautiful, and we're in the kind of in a valley where we have the mesa is surrounding us, so we're in the little canyon there.
The house that your grandfather built for your grandmother, is that the house that you grew up in?
My dad grew up there. My dad and his siblings grew up there. As they grew up, my dad was actually the first of the family to go to college. So it was a big deal back then. So then he went to college, he got a degree, then he became a teacher, and he got his first job in Grants, New Mexico, which is a small town outside of Albuquerque, and that's
So
where
he left the ranch.
he left the ranch,
Wow.
which is a big deal. So, and he got his teaching license, and that's where I grew up, was a small town. But he would go back weekends and holidays and summers, especially, that was nice for him as a teacher because he would have summers off and the holidays. And so all of those holidays and weekend, in fact, he would go back on weekends, probably. Boy, I guess it's probably similar to me. Like at least once a month we would do what needed to be done. It was a lot of ranch work. And I mean, it's still a lot of work, but my parents live there now. So he moved back to the ranch and he lives there permanently.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. In
Yeah.
my head they lived there always. But
No,
he left. So
my
he
dad grew
left
up
and you grew up where?
I grew up in Grants, New Mexico. Grants.
Grants, New Mexico.
It's on Highway 66, the old Highway 66, Route 66.
Wow, that's an amazing story. See, I think my father was the first one in the family to go to college. So I know that that's a huge
Yeah, it was a
deal.
huge deal back then. Absolutely.
We were coal miners. Like my family was coal miners. And then I think my grandfather went to seminary and he was supposed to be a priest, but in the end it was like it ain't it
Oh,
that
wow.
no. No,
Yeah.
that's not going to work. But I realize, like, to me, when I look at my family history and I look at that moment in time, it's the thing that we're all looking for. Your family, that's another moment when they stake their claim on that property. That was a big moment in your
Yeah.
family. I'm getting chills just thinking about the progression of things. And then here's your dad, he goes to college and he's a
Yeah.
teacher.
Yeah. And he went to teaching, but he would still go back. And then when he retired, he moved there permanently. And so when I go down, I haven't been to my hometown in, years, maybe a decade. Like when I go visit my parents, it's at the ranch. They still have a house in Grants, but they live full time at the ranch. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. They have
And did they build their own house there?
Yes. So we have what we call Grandma's house, which is the original flagstone adobe house, and then my dad built a house for him and my mom, and then actually Veronica and I have a little house for us when we go, so we have some space.
Who lives in Grandma's house?
My uncle Archie lives in Amarillo, and he comes every weekend, and he helps my dad on the ranch every weekend and holidays. But he works as an engineer in Amarillo.
So when they acquired the land, where they were ranchers, and they probably made their money from the land, I assume.
They ran cattle, yeah, and tried to do a little bit of farming. But yes, they raised the cattle, chickens, pigs, and then they would take it to auction to survive, make ends meet. My dad's the oldest. I didn't really know my grandfather too well. He actually died when I was 1 year old. My dad he tells a story that he took me as a baby to see my grandfather in the hospital, and he had diabetes, passed to diabetes. Yeah, there's lots of history there, actually. You can see my grandfather's house, but we're actually on the other side of the fence and that's our main stake. So we would spend weekends and holidays there. As a child, I would spend summers there. There's just lots of work, like fixing the fences, feeding the cattle. So we run about 100 head of cattle. And
what does that mean when you say we run?
We have 100 cows. And so they, each year they breed, they have the bulls. And so then they breed the calves. And every 4th of July, we have to brand the cattle so that we can know which ones are ours versus the neighbors. It's kind of like if you've ever seen City Slickers, that's kind of,
I love that movie. Movie night. We need to watch it.
Yeah.
You know what my favorite part of that movie is when I think it's Billy Crystal. He's helping to deliver the calf.
Yeah.
And his watch comes off. Do you remember that part?
Yeah. And his watch comes off? No, I don't remember.
His watch comes off, I think, in the cow or something like that. I don't know. Something weird like that.
Oh, yes, when they were delivering the calf.
And it was so symbolic. I love that movie. Movie night.
Yeah. But it is just that kind of experience where you have the cows, and we have to take care of them. And, but every year we brand the new calves. And then every year they take a certain amount of cows and calves to the auction. And that's how you would survive. So you make a living off of the calves that are raised and then taken to auction.
Let me tell you, that is such an American story. And the evolution of your family is such, from the 1800s to now, is such an American story.
It is interesting if you sit down and think about it, for sure.
Yeah. I love that. I get chills just thinking about it.
Because, and a lot of people just don't realize, there is a lot of history, though, because, we would go, and when I grew up, we would go out there. There's no running water. So it was a windmill. So it's a well, and it's a windmill. So there's a lesson in patience. I just remember, because my grandmother, when I would spend summers with my grandmother, she would send me, we basically, you have to warm up water to bathe or whatever. There's the outhouse. There's in order to cook, you warm up the water. And so I remember we'd have Clorox bottles. Like, they would save the Clorox bottles, and then as to save the water, and we would take probably 8 to 10 Clorox bottles in the old Jeep that we have, which the old Jeep is 1961 Jeep Willie, and that's how I learned how to drive. So when I was probably 10.
Wow.
Yeah, I was in grade school. It goes back to the psychology of it. You will do what's expected of you, and so if your elders expect you to do things, you do it. I took a course on certain things, and they were talking about an old story about they found some letters, and it states how the responsibility of this particular kid was to go and herd the sheep. They would have to walk 4 miles, herd the sheep, and take care of the sheep. And the question was, how old do you think this kid was? And people would say, 6, maybe 5. Well, the answer was 2. So
No
years old,
way.
they were they had to go and take care and herd sheep, and they have letters with documentation of this, and I mean, it's kind of it makes me think of the ranch because when I was a kid, my grandmother put me in charge of the fire, and so I love fires now. And I was like, I'm 8 years old and I'm in charge of, we back then we have a barrel and we'd burn the trash and stuff. And so it was my responsibility take care of that kind of stuff. It was my responsibility to go get water, and that's where I'm leading with this. Is they taught me how to drive the Jeep so that I could drive to the windmill and wait for the wind to blow so that it would pump water, and I would fill the jugs of Clorox bottles, and you would sit there maybe 40 minutes to fill 8 bottles of water, so we would take it back so that we could have to wash our hands and such. And
You know, this reminds me of, and I think I told you and Veronica about my nephew and how, I don't know if I told you this, for his birthday, because usually they have this big party for Finley. And this year they wanted to buy him, what do you call that, ATV? And so what they asked all the family members if they would contribute to that, and in lieu of the whatever we would get them. And I was very apprehensive about it because he's 7 years old. And
yeah,
the reason they wanted it is because they're constantly out in the backcountry doing stuff, and he has mobility issues. And so I just said, okay, I'm going to do what they asked and trust them.
yeah,
This kid drives, like, is a very good driver at 7 years old. And
yeah,
so it does kind of flip this idea of how we coddle our children, which I'm definitely guilty of. Raising my daughter in the 80s, the
each
1980s.
generation does more and more of it. We are it seems like each generation gets a little bit more used to accommodations. We take things for granted, it seems to me.
Right. And that's the one thing I love about my niece is because I want to protect my nephew. And she is actually protecting her son by making him more independent and making him figure out how to do things.
You can make that argument so that they're
Yeah, and listening to your stories makes me think of that, and I can see the value in that. And I think we need to get more back to that. And I love the other thing I wanted to say about your story is I love that you had this life where you're living in the regular world in
yeah,
Grants. Is it with an S, Grants?
yes.
But then on the weekend, you are being forced into this completely different reality, that just makes you have to be resourceful. And what a value that was. And I know from knowing you, because when you and Veronica moved into town and I got to know you, I just really liked who you were. I liked the way you do things. You're outside of the box. You'd have these parties and you'd invite people from all walks of life, where I tend to be more focused on the people that I, spend my time with. And I feel like I've learned a lot from you guys in the past. How long have you been here? 3 years?
Uh, it's yeah, we're going on 4. It'll be 4 this I think December since we bought the house.
And I think some of it is because of the ranch. Some of it is because of your scope of the world. I know. Um, okay, I'm going to say one more thing and then we'll get back to your story. But I know for myself, I was married to a man from the Middle East, and we went to the Middle East. I was like a narrow-minded American. We went to the Middle East and I saw a completely different reality, and it just expanded my mind, and it made me more open to other people from other ethnicities, from other countries.
Right,
And
right. And I think Veronica and I try and how do I say, be inclusive with some diversity. I think we've been fortunate enough to have a background that allows us to have seen different cultures and appreciate the value in them. So we, I think, try very hard to be inclusive and realize that there are good people in every any age, nationality. But
socioeconomic,
yeah, right.
political leaning.
Yes, there are good people,
Okay.
bad people,
Well,
and
and I feel like you guys teach me that more and more every day, and I appreciate that. I'm really grateful for it.
well, that's very kind. Yeah, I guess I think it is interesting to see the world in different people's perspective. Veronica and I have different backgrounds, and so we met in at CU Boulder 26 odd years ago, whatever. But yeah, I came from New Mexico. She came from Texas, and we stayed in Colorado, and we've been here since. And so we love Colorado. We love Georgetown. We love the historic part of that. That's actually what brings us here. Is that was a big part. Georgetown had all of the aspects that we were looking for, and one of those is just the historic. We love the historic part of it.
Hmm.
It brings us back to our childhood. Veronica sitting on the porch with her grandma, like that was
And you live in a historic home. When was your house built?
1879.
Wow. And that's early for Georgetown in this area. That's like 20 years after it was founded,
Yeah,
pretty much.
back when it was booming. In fact, I think it was shortly after. Well, no, I guess in the 90s is when it started to slow down, right? I think
Yeah,
18.
93 was when they repealed the silver standard and things went into a depression here.
Yeah, but yeah, so it was. It's built in 79, but that's part of what we love. I mean, I think we both have that history. With Veronica spent some time with her grandparents, and I spent time with my grandma at the ranch in an old house without running water. So with the outhouse, I mean, oh my goodness, yeah. If you had to go at night, that was a disaster, man. And no, until I met Veronica, and so then when I met Veronica and I took her out to the ranch, she was not having that. So since then we have, we've irrigated and we've run the water lines from the well to the house, and now we have running water. We have the whole, I mean, everything. We have high speed internet out there,
Oh,
which
wow.
yeah, we have the TVs, which is a lot different than when I grew up, though. Like I grew up, I mean, it was hard to take a nap because it was so hot. Like in the middle of summer, it's so hot. You're just
Oof.
looking for shade. And now just going back to just being spoiled. Like each generation is a little bit more spoiled, in my opinion. Like we just get used to certain things. We take a lot
Yeah.
of things for granted. And so that's my background. So like when we have this situation where we're out of water, I can manage that. We know how to deal with that. However,
Right.
my wife is a different thing. Like
Yeah.
I can't have her go through that. And
Right.
so
Well, just as background for our listeners, you had an issue with the pipeline going into the plumbing going into your house, and so you were literally without running water for how long?
uh, boy, 2 weeks, I think.
2 weeks. Oh my God. I couldn't do
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I mean,
And can I add that it's during the pandemic
yeah, it was
where
during the pandemic, right?
yeah, you can't just go to the public restroom because especially at that point it was, just at the beginning when we were really freaked out.
Right. And so yeah,
So,
otherwise you just go stay at the hotel or go stay with a friend.
right.
But in the middle of a pandemic, that was,
You are totally prepared for that.
yeah. I mean, personally, I mean that I can manage that, but
Yeah.
my wife. So yeah, so we ended up having to. We plumbed water. We have all the amenities now. So
Yeah.
and so now it's rather enjoyable. Now we can actually sit there and enjoy the scenery and just appreciate the land and the horses. And as they walk by in the morning, it's just a totally serene environment. Uh,
Does your ranch have a name?
the Maes Ranch.
The Maes Ranch. Okay. And
Yeah.
so how is it divided up now, the ranch? Have you, I mean, obviously as new generations come along, do you split up the land or is the land all still
In
one
the
plot?
paper, yeah, in the paperwork, it's all shared properties. Like now,
Interesting.
yeah, it's gonna get kind of interesting now. So like it was all my grandmother was the matriarch for the longest time. She had it, and so now that she has passed, it has been kind of divided equally among the siblings with the understanding that it has to be kept together, as opposed to when my grandfather's brother got upset and ended up selling it, and he put it in the paperwork that they would not sell to the family, and so it was just a family feud.
So was it after that point, I'm just going to call it a communal kind of thing, was that then put into legal paperwork to say that it would all be kept together?
Yes, so like our land is in the paperwork that it would all be kept together.
So what is the future of it? I mean, I don't know. Are there any new generations or?
Yeah, that's it's going to be interesting. I have a few cousins. I mean, it's a smaller family at this point. Like that's my dad's side of the family is smaller. My mom's side of the family is relatively large. Like my mom grew up with, she had 12 siblings too, and then all the
Wow.
siblings had multiple kids and grandkids. But on my dad's side, there was really not very many. My grandmother on my dad's side had four grandchildren, me and three other cousins that I have, and
Wow.
but none of them really have any interest in the ranch. Yeah, except
No, that's
the only one that goes down there, spend some time. I mean, I love it. But it's a totally different. It is absolutely different world. And I think that's another reason why we loved Georgetown, because it's in between. So like we spent the city life, right, and then there's the ranch life, which are completely opposites. Georgetown is kind of in the middle. So like we have a little bit more quieter than the city life, but also we get those moments of serenity where we can sit outside and enjoy a little bit of the land and the landscape. Whereas out at the ranch, it's just so peaceful. I mean, to sit out on the deck with
mm-hmm.
cars and absolutely no light pollution, you can see. I mean, you literally can see the Milky Way. It's just gorgeous.
Wow.
And you see every star in the world. That's part of why I like that too, is that because it tends to give me perspective. It makes you realize your problems are not that big, man. It makes you realize your scope in the world. It gives you
How
perspective.
small we really are and how
Yeah,
small
that's what we
what
really are.
we see is our conflict and problems are. You're right.
Yeah.
I have a really hard time stepping back from that and seeing that perspective. And I do like that about you. Another thing to sing your praises. I like your honesty. And if we're sitting there and I'm complaining about something, you give me that, you feed that perspective to me, and it forces me to have to think a little differently than where my mind would naturally go.
Well, yeah,
And
we as humans, I mean, that's just natural. But that's
yeah,
where, again, the ranch is just a different side of things. Like you go out there and you makes you realize how lucky we have it. Because if you think about the life that the people had previously, I mean, that was a tough life, man. I mean, just a lot of work. You're basically trying to survive, but they would do it.
right. My romantic idea would be that it would continue on in the family and that it would stay together. It looks like that could change because of the lack of interest, and the family has gotten smaller from what you said.
Yeah, I don't. I would. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that transpires. Uh,
Yeah,
because
definitely.
I will say that there seems to be a lack of interest in the younger generation. They don't have the same interest as my dad, his siblings, and I love it. I absolutely love it. But it is a different world, and so and if you talk to Veronica, she'll give you a different perspective too, because there's the city life and there's the country life, and they're different. But yeah, we'd love to have you out there just to get some
Oh,
perspective.
I'm dying to. Bob would freaking love it.
Oh,
I would.
Bob would love it. Bob would actually love it because I mean we
He would.
can hikes, we can do the ATV rides. We can do the jeeping. Oh man, he would love the jeeping. There's
You
trails.
would love it.
So like when I do these trails, these are just normal trails, right? Like we do that every day when we're when we're having to gather the cows, and those trails are actually, some of them can get really hairy. And so when I
Yeah.
hear people talking about the jeeping, I'm like, because if I were to take them out to the ranch and we would do some of these back trails, they would get some perspective. It's so funny because
Well,
my
I get nervous on these trails, but I'm a wimp.
yeah. Oh man, if you would not enjoy rides with my dad, then my dad, he absolutely loves to test the limits on things. Like, so I'm even out there with him, like, damn, dad, like, I mean, you just feel like you're on the side of a hill and you're just like, oh my goodness, we're gonna flip. But no, he's like he gets it done. I mean, but he's totally old school. That's where it's funny because he's all about function. Like that generation, I, you know what? Does it work? I mean, it might not look the prettiest. That's where Veronica likes the aesthetics, and so
Yeah.
we like it. And so we're a good combination because I like things to work and she likes things to look pretty. So
Yep.
they got to be both.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my dad is
You guys
totally,
make a great team. So
yeah.
what did your father teach?
He was a one teacher in a schoolhouse. So he taught
Oh, wow.
grades. He was the administrator and teacher like that. I mean that was back in the day when that was almost completely old school. But so we lived in Grants, but he taught in a small town, even smaller town outside of Grants that had a one. Well, it had two rooms actually. It was a two-room schoolhouse. It did have a gymnasium, but basically he taught all first through sixth grade.
Wow. All
Yeah,
at once.
all at once in the same class, and he did that for 20 some odd years. And it's a kind of amazing story because even now people are like, "Oh, Mr. Maes."
How many teachers were in that school?
I think he had one, and then at times he had two.
Did you go to that school? You didn't
I
go to
didn't
that.
go to that school. I stayed in Grants, but he taught. It was, I think, about 30 or 40 miles outside of town. So he would drive back and forth. But again, for country people, it's not that big a deal. Like and for me, like people ask all the time, like driving, I'm like, it doesn't bother me. I guess because I was used to it. Like at the ranch, the nearest town is an hour and a half. When I got kicked by a horse and broke my arm, I took some ibuprofen and we had an hour and a half ride to the hospital.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're used to, like, the grocery store is an hour and a half. The small grocery store, the nearest larger town is about 2 hours and 15 minutes. So like a major grocery store, Walmart or whatever. And
Hmm.
my parents, they still live there, so that going to the doctor, they drive an hour. Anything you need to do, you drive an hour. And so you get that mentality. It's just really not that big a deal. I mean, that's country life though.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like city, it's going from store to store. If I forgot to buy milk, I'll just go to the store. At the ranch, you have to plan that stuff out. You can't just you have to have your list, and you make sure that you have all your supplies.
Right.
You forgot it, you
You don't
do.
run. You can't run up to the
Yeah,
Georgetown Market.
you do without. That's what you do. And
Yeah.
you make it work. That's what
Let me.
happens.
I have a
That's
question for you about this. So, my mother, she was born in Belgium. She grew up during the war uh, and the Depression. And so I always felt growing up in this American society with my mother, I always felt deprived because she would want us to be resourceful and make do with what we had. And she thought there was a lot of waste, like we were very wasteful, and she would not allow that. I felt, looking back, now as an older person though, I have a lot more understanding and appreciation for that way of being that my mother was. But at the time, I felt like, oh, I wanted the stuff that the other kids had, like the cool clothes, the designer clothes, the this, the that. Why do we have to shop at thrift stores? Why don't you have a Tupperware party instead of using Oleo dishes as
Yeah,
Tupperware?
yeah.
Like, I resented that when I was younger because I felt so different from the other kids. But it seems like you at the time, I don't know, did you feel that at all, or did you just rolled with the punches and you
You
did
do.
what was required of you and you didn't have
I
that
think it's
petty.
yeah. I mean that you just we didn't. I didn't have a choice. It was like you. That's the way it was, and we deal with it. So I mean, I don't think I thought too much about that. Sometimes I'd be like, man, this is too much. Like we just, working on the ranch and I'm like, man, I just want to go home right now. But, that was as a kid. And as I grew older and right now I just appreciate it so much. It's just so different for me. It's just,
Hmm.
it's a total, relaxing situation for me just because it's so peaceful. But it's a lot of work,
Right,
though. It's a productive work that and I guess it's physical work. So like
right.
you're using energy and
Mm.
it's exhausting, but it's gratifying. And so, but yeah, growing up, you did what you did, and
Mhm.
because my grandmother same. She grew up through the Depression, and that's where and my dad still has that same habit where he kind of hoards things. Like he has a hard time getting rid of things because of that. Like my grandma
Yeah, my mom was like
would
that.
say she wouldn't throw it away. She like you never know when you're going to need that. And I guess growing through the Depression, they didn't buy new things. They just
Hmm.
held on to it. And at the ranch, because there's so much space, they just store it, and it's just like it's almost. I mean, it's borderline hoarding, man. The Veronica, it's hoarding, and I'll say, well, they're saving it, but there's just a lot of stuff there that I mean, I wish they would display more of it because my dad has a lot of antiques and historic stuff that's just in the garage. I'm like, man, this is beautiful, this is gorgeous, but there's
Yeah.
a place to. Yeah, they could almost make their own museum. I think they just have so much. Like that, my dad has the '61 Jeep Willys. Again, I grew up driving on that. That's how I learned to drive. That's where my love for Jeep stems from. Uh,
Hmm.
Three on the floor. I mean, max speed on that Jeep was like 40 miles an hour. I mean, it's more utilitarian. The passenger side, it's a two-seater. The passenger side to clean the windows, like the windshield wiper, is a manual windshield wiper. There's no radio, ni nada. It's just,
Hmm.
yeah, it's to get you from point A to point B. We would use it to fix fences. To go get the horses. So back in the day, in fact, that's how they got the Jeep originally, is because my grandfather used to drive the short bus. Like he would drive around the county and pick up the kids and take them to the schoolhouse in Mosquero, which is probably 40 miles away. So he would drive to all the ranches and pick up the kids. And so what happened is when it would rain, it would get stuck. And every time he'd have to go get the horses to pull out.
Oh my goodness.
My grandfather got tired of getting the horses out, so that's why he ended up buying a Jeep so that they could pull out the bus when it got stuck. So I don't know. It's just interesting for me.
It is a fascinating history, and you were worried about that, but I knew that I was really excited about hearing about it.
I would love to get you out there one day when it's not a pandemic,
When
maybe.
it's not a pandemic, yeah. I I
But
will
yeah,
hope
and
I will hope
I'm
to
pretty
do
sure
that.
Bob would love it out there.
Oh,
Even
he would.
walk looking for arrowheads. Like you can still go out there, and we're in the canyon, so like when it rains, things get discovered. So like there's a lot of old Indian
Yeah.
arrowheads, uh,
Wow.
artifacts. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
interesting.
I'll bring my metal detector.
Yeah, absolutely.
How is this history depicted in popular culture? And I know this is a very specific history to your family, but you already said, what was the name of that movie with Billy Crystal?
Oh, city slickers.
City Slickers. I'll link out to that. because you talked about it. So I'll put a link to the IMBD page for that or something. But is there another place where this history, and it doesn't have to be your family necessarily, doesn't have to be this town unless your town is actually in some kind of popular culture, a book, a novel, a movie, a series, a documentary. And if it's not that specific history, but a similar history, is it depicted somewhere else in pop culture?
I mean, Yellowstone comes to mind, but that's a modern day, like modern day ranching and that mentality of saving the ranch. That's the new series with Kevin Costner. It's like a family owned ranch. I mean, it's a little bit different. It wasn't, I mean, but that the concept is similar actually.
Yeah.
It's out of Montana.
So then my final question to you is, what do you want people to know? What do you want people to be left with after, talking about this history? What do you want people to know about it?
I mean, that's really American history, American evolution. That's really the history of the country and the Old West. You know what? There is a documentary about the West. I think it's called The West, and I can't remember who actually.
Ken Burns?
Yeah.
Is it Ken Burns?
Yeah, Ken Burns, the West. I am pretty fascinated with that. But yeah, just kind of documenting how people came to this part of the country, I guess. Of it, yeah, the family evolution, because you're right, it has evolved in generation over generation, and it's just things have changed, and it's interesting just to see the difference. But yeah, if you were ever able to see and how difficult those lives were, that was a tough life. That was a tough life.
Yeah, and of course, in that time period on the East Coast, they had already evolved to this, life of comfort, even though maybe today we wouldn't see it that way, but they did have a lot of comforts.
Yeah.
That they didn't have on the ranch.
You're right.
At that same period in time.
But that's what they knew, and that's how, as it's human nature, that's what you knew, that's what you know, and
right.
You don't know any different.
Is there anything else that I didn't ask you or that we didn't cover that you want to talk about?
I don't think so.
I think that was a fascinating history. I'm really excited about this episode. Les Maes, thank you so much for being here and sharing your family history with us.
Thank you for having me.
So there you have it. Les Maes and the Family Ranch. Be sure to check out our episode notes where you'll find links to a photo gallery and other resources regarding this episode. Before I go, I'd like to give a big shout out to Patreon supporters Evan Aguirre, John Swan, and David Carroll. I'd also like to thank our Ko-fi supporter, Ruth Rosenfeld. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.